This ceremony begins the liturgical season of our Sangha. And the reason that we begin here is because it's understood, whether we are doing it together as a community or we're doing it as individuals, the first thing that we must deal with is what we call the shadow. That is the beginning of all awakening. And if we do not engage it, no matter what we're doing, it will be a veneer. And so that's why we begin here. Now, some of the things that I'm going to tell you and say in this, you can take however you wish. That's entirely up to you. Now, some will take this more literally, and others will take it more metaphorically. And as I said, it's entirely up to you. But I will share with you the deep teachings, and I hope to show you something that our tradition offers that takes a slightly different perspective on what all of this means. So I'm going to begin with a quote. And the first quote is by one of my favorite directors, Guillermo del Toro. You guys familiar with Guillermo? No? You should become familiar with him. This is one of his quotes. "Monsters are my friends. I've been saved and absolved by them because monsters are the patron saints of our blissful imperfections." And this is a quote by Carl Jung, the person who first coined the term shadow. "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." So the sermon, this Segaki sermon, is called Ghosts, Monsters, and Skeletons. We had a bunch of those out on the street earlier. Now I'm going to read a piece of this because this is also for our priests in training. This is part of their class, so they will get a copy of all this. So what is the shadow? The shadow is the first emergence from the dazzling darkness of the Dharmakaya. So what does that mean? Well, when we talk about the origin of things, we talk about it in a way that is somewhat hard to pin down. And so darkness and images of darkness or dazzling darkness have always been used by Buddhists because what does that mean? Well, you can't see anything in the dark. So this is the unseen. This is something that the mind cannot comprehend. This is something that words can't describe. And the roots of the shadow that emerge from the Dharmakaya. So our understanding is, well, you want to talk about it as an individual or the universe, that from this dazzling darkness, from this great void, from this great shunya, comes forth consciousness. And in that coming forth of consciousness, because it is coming out of the darkness, the first experience we have is the shadow. Now, psychologically, the shadow represents all of the conditioning that we experienced when we were young, where we didn't even have the ability, maybe necessarily, to understand things, but we were experiencing things. But most of those experiences just then resided in the body, in the nervous system. There was no conscious way to explain it. The other thing the shadow represents is anything that's repressed. Now, repression means that it wasn't intentional, or it wasn't a conscious, willful decision, but rather it was the ego's natural reaction to things that were too scary, too confusing, or just something we couldn't understand. But all of that information is within us. And then we go from that stage into developing this identity, this ego. But the shadow, the roots of this shadow, and again, remember, the terms I'm using you can take literally or metaphorically. The roots of this shadow goes down into the hell of resentment. And the initial visage is always one of fear. So when you encounter the shadow within yourself, or you experience it from someone else, because that happens too, projection of this shadow. The first experience is fear. If it's real, it's fear. It's the fear of the unknown. Now, however, it is believed within Buddhism that we're not left to our own devices, that within us is also an aspect that is awake. We call that Buddha or Buddha nature. It is always there. It's a part of the dazzling darkness. It's a part of the consciousness. It's sort of like, you know, when they study sleep cycles, they talk about alpha, beta, theta, delta, and there's gamma. And gamma permeates everything. So think of the Buddha nature as permeating every stage. And that often appears in forms. Sometimes it'll appear in our dreams. Sometimes it'll appear in our imaginations. But we talk about these figures as, in the Western tradition, angelic. So what does angelic mean? A messenger. That's what the word means, messenger. And so what is the message? Fear not. Fear not. And so the first message that we get in terms of our true nature with regard to the shadow is don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. And this emergence into consciousness out of the shadow we call the crux. It is the crux of consciousness becoming aware. It is the ambiguous aspect of the psyche. This is the first step in enlightenment. Now, when I say it is the ambiguous aspect of the psyche, what do I mean? We don't like ambiguity. Ambiguity, our reaction is usually ambivalence. That's how we first stave it off. But the fact of the matter is that ambiguity is in all of us. It's in everything. And part of what the shadow teaches us is how to be one with ambiguity. Not seeking absolute answers, but becoming one with them. I don't know if any of you here musically are into hard rock or heavy metal. Anybody? All right. So some of you may have heard of the late, great Ronnie James Dio. I was blessed to be friends with Ronnie James Dio. He was very deep. He understood all of this. And in his last work, he showed in his songs, in his words, all this stuff. And there was a song called The Devil Cried. And the song gives us the insight of how to approach our shadow, how to approach it. First, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. The lines from the song are, in the song, this lost soul who confronts the devil. And he says to the devil, "So I told him about my pain and the life that I'd been through. He just smiled, and the laughter came." So that's also sometimes what happens when we first confront the shadow. We see it as something antagonistic, very unpleasant. But this is the secret to engaging it, embracing it, and opening ourselves to the wonder and the grace of it. The character says, "And then I told him that I love you." And the devil cried. So this is the entry point. The entry point of the shadow is to turn to it, not with fear, but with love. Why is this important? Because, as I mentioned, the shadow is the repressed aspects of our persona. What are those? Those are the masks we wear. Those are the things that we've been given over time. Those are the things we've created to deal with life. Those are the things that we put on. And again, it's not conscious, it's a defensive reaction. And we put those on, and it represents everything that we've repressed that came from the conditioning of our parents or the conditioning of our society. And all of that becomes this mask that we wear. Now, sometimes that can be skillful, but many times it is not. It doesn't really reveal who we are because we don't want people to know who we really are. We're afraid if they really knew who we were, they would run away. And sometimes what happens then is we come back up against that ambiguity once more. And we say, I am good, or I am bad. And we find ourselves in that place of duality. Am I good? Am I bad? None are good. If you are familiar with the Christian tradition, Jesus has once asked this question, and what does he say? Do not call me good, because I believe he understood. And if we don't become aware, if we don't embrace the shadow, engage it, if we don't do these things, what happens? And again, I'm using some analogies and metaphors for the season. We become a werebeast. A werebeast. What does that mean? It means that the curse of the werebeast is put upon us. Sometimes we're Dr. Jekyll, and then we're Mr. Hyde. Or Sister Hyde, as the great Hammer movie had it. We become the werewolf, the beast. There's a beast, but we don't show the beast, but the beast still comes out. It might come out in little ways, or it might come out in big ways. But the thing that we must embrace above all is we are not good. That's an evaluation made in distinction with bad. All of this resides in us. If we are awake, we learn to dance with this. We learn to move with this. And this creates the energy of our life, the energy of enlightenment itself. But if we don't, we're like the werebeast. Sometimes we're Larry Talbot, real friendly guy. But when the moon is full, we become the beast. And the reason I talk about the cycles of the moon, because we project the shadow outward. If we don't understand it, we don't engage it, we project it onto others. We project it onto others that we fear, others that we say are evil, others that we say are bad. And we project it onto them. And that's when we're the beast. So we must move beyond this, because the cycles of the moon represent the cycles of projection. Sometimes when we project psychologically, it's all light. And other times it's all dark. We are not to become perfect, but whole, but one. And one of the things you learn about working with the shadow is you know that whatever is wrong in the world is wrong in yourself. And if you, in some way, learn to deal with your shadow, in some small way, you've done something real for the world. Because you're not going to allow the shadow in its dark form, its negative form, to be what you project or what you live out of. So in some small way, you contribute to the wholeness of all of us. The shadow is the place of grace. That's really a weird thing in the Dharma. It's the place of grace. Now, we all know what grace is, right? But let me tell you how I define it. Grace is the acceptable of the unacceptable. It's the accepting of the unacceptable. The shadow accepts you not because you deserve it, because you're good. It accepts you because you are unacceptable. Now, what does that mean? It means that it is the place of grace. That is the place where no matter what you've done, no matter who you think you are, that is the place you can go to. There you are accepted. In my pastoral career as a chaplain, I have worked in very dark places with people very possessed by this. Rapists, murderers, child molesters, you name it. That figure, which represents something I'll talk about, becomes their patron in their journey back to awakening. But that becomes a place of grace because no one accepts them outside. But that is always acceptable. That is the place where we are always received and welcomed. And when we experience it as that, it becomes the shade of the enlightened mind. Now the shadow becomes a shelter from the hot glaze and gaze of the searing sun. It becomes the coolness. And it allows us to transform hatred into the self-acknowledgement of the shadow so that we don't continue to project it outward. So when I see someone do something heinous, something terrible, because of my practice, not because I'm good, but because of my practice, I ask myself, and I mean this sincerely, why would I do that? Why did I do that? Because I believe that in oneness, I am not separate from anything, and there is nothing that anyone has done is foreign to me. And so that's the first question I ask. And you know what that does? It gets rid of judgment, man. It gets rid of judgment. The great Christian philosopher G.K. Chesterton once said, if you cannot show this grace, at least remember your own sins. And so it allows us to experience a sense of oneness with those that normally we would turn from. And when we say, oh, I don't understand that. You ever notice that when someone does something? Well, it's not me, it's them. We try to put it in categories. We try to separate it from ourselves so it's safe. I don't. It is me. It is a part of me. And a lot of us don't want to accept that. It scares us. But when you do accept it, when you do bring it in, there's grace, there's freedom, there's release. Now I'm using a few more alliterations here. So once we embrace this, one of the experiences you have is overcoming the fear by facing the transient and contingent, which is really pretty much all of our experiences. And we transcend it. And as human beings, we cannot, according to the Dharma, we can't fully live until we have embraced the shadow. And part of the shadow, too, that it represents, is death. The end of this cycle of transiency and contingency. And so we must embrace death. And in the metaphor of the season, we become the undead. And we rise from our graves anew. no longer alive, no longer dead, but something transcendent. One of the monikers or titles of the Buddha was the deathless, the Death Eater. I don't know if J.K. Rowling got it from the Buddha, but that was one of the words, the Death Eater. A lot of people don't know that. And so we learn to be in the world but not of it. What does that mean? It means that we know that this transient experience of the ego, of Tony, won't last. It started here, it will end there. But the ground of my being, the very nature of my being, that was never born and will never die. So the task of my life, bless you, is to embrace this broken, shadowed creature with love and compassion. No one is bullied into getting better. So trying to knock it down and keep ourselves in constrictions so that we don't show that part of ourselves, that never works. But we embrace that aspect of ourselves so that we love it. And I said to the devil, I love you. Other images have appeared throughout time. One of those is the dreaded dragon. The dragon. And there's a saying in mythological lore about the dreaded dragon's tail. And the dragon is a monster. And the dragon is a creature that wants to possess things and keep them even though it can't use them. I don't know if you're a fan of Tolkien or Lord of the Rings, but Smaug was obsessed with the gold, but Smaug could not use the gold. And that's the truth of the monster. It wants things, it desires things to possess them when it can't even really use them. It's what the status represents. And by embracing the shadow, what happens to the dragon's tail is it becomes the healing tail of the serpent. The dragon is transformed from that fearful, fiery creature into the serpent of healing and wisdom. You ever wonder why it says in the Hebrew scriptures that Moses held up his staff with a snake curled upon it? Have you ever seen the Greek symbols of healing and medicine? The staff of Asclepius. And you see it in our hospitals and on our emergency vehicles go through, and you see that staff. But that's what it becomes. That dreaded dragon tail that tries to hold us to the confusion, delusion, and hatred and greed of the ego self becomes the healing balm, the healing venom of the serpent. And our goal is not to slay the dragon, but to find its sacred heart. Another Dio illusion there. The Nyoi jewel, it's called Nyoi, N-Y-O-I. And that is the jewel of who we really, truly are. This whole mix of things. Enlightened being living through the manifestation of this ego. And we learn not to get rid of anything, because we can't. Have you ever had that experience where you thought you dealt with something years ago, and then it pops its head up? And you're like, man, I thought I was done with that. Why is it haunting me now? That's because we don't get rid of it. In the story of the Buddha, Mara. Mara is the Satan figure, the devil figure that tempts him. But you know what's really cool? His temptation is not unlike that Christ experiences in the desert. The difference is the Buddha invites him to hang out. And so throughout his life, Mara is right there with him. Now he's still kind of whispering in his ear from time to time as the Buddha's starting his movement. Like all people start movements, you want them to grow. You want lots of people to benefit from what you have. And at one moment during this period, Mara whispers to Buddha, why don't you let me take this? I'll organize it for you. So the example is to live with it, not to get rid of it, but embrace it, to walk with it. So that's the shadow. You digging this so far? Now we're going to talk about ghosts. The Buddha likened the 5 stages of development, we call them skandhas in Sanskrit. Those 5 stages of development, he likened it to the levels of a house that was built. It started before we were born. But we build this house. The basement, in this metaphor, is the shadow. It's a dark place. It's kind of wet. It smells strange. In the attic, there's other floors there. The attic represents the ego identity, the persona. And together, they represent the hunger ghosts, the Gaki. In our title, Segaki. The Gaki are the hungry ghosts, the hungry spirits. Because they're constantly hungering for that which they feel they don't have. When the reality is they've always had it. Everything that they need is within them, but they're always looking outside for it. And so they become these hungry ghosts. As you might gather by now, you know I'm a big fan of movies. M. Night Shyamalan had a wonderful picture called The Sixth Sense. Do you recall it? And in the story, the little boy, right, is afraid of these ghosts. Those are the hungry ghosts. And then at one point, Bruce Willis helps him to see that if he turns and listens to them, embraces them, they're free. They no longer haunt him. And that's the same for us. A hungry ghost can represent things within our own psyche, with our own being, with our own conditioning. My Zen teacher, the late, great Bernie Glassman, once had an awakening experience, a kensho. Kensho is a Japanese word that means I see through to things as they are. And he was driving in the back of a car, and he was driving through a part of the city, and there were homeless everywhere. And he felt his heart break, and he saw them as hungry ghosts. And from that moment on, he devoted his life to feeding the hungry ghosts, to meeting them where they were. So it's not just for ourselves, it's also for everyone else. And we feed the hungry ghosts with compassion instead of fear. Tonight, you're going to be asked to write down something on this slip of paper, something maybe forbidden, maybe something that you've never really worked through. Maybe you don't even know how to. That's okay too. But then you will write it down, fold it, and then you will offer it to the fires. The fires of awakening. And when we do this, part, now, let me talk about skeletons for a moment. So this can represent our skeletons. Our skeletons are the closet of the past. They rattle. They try to scare us, bring us back into fear and loathing. Haunted memories of deeds done or done to us. All of them out of the poisons of delusion and hatred and greed. But in repentance and reconciliation, we make an accord. Now that word repentance, boy, when I use that, and I love that word, it really freaks people out. But what does it really mean? repentance and reconciliation, because that's what this ceremony is. It means that I realize that no matter how hard I try, I miss the mark. I'm like an archer in the darkness with a target I can't even see. That's my humanity. But I'm still slinging those arrows. I missed the mark. The Greek word is metanoia. And it's a really simple image. I'm going down through the forest to get to somewhere I want to be, and I'm lost, and I realize I'm lost. Repentance is just realizing I'm lost and finding due north. That's all it is. It's not flagellation, beating of the chest. It's just recognition. That doesn't do anyone any good. Who benefits from that? That's just the ego's persona. Oh, I'm bad. No, you're not bad. You're not good. That's the ambiguity again. And through the work of this at-one-ment or accord, we are graciously forgiven before the foundations of the world. What does that mean? That means before we were. It's all understood. The Buddha once said, if you truly saw things as they were, you would never hold any enmity against yourself or anyone. So when it's held no more against us, we learn to dance with the skeletons in our closet, on the graveyard of the foregone, a moonlit party of the dead. With great gratitude and the offering of our lives in laughter and love, those bones are raised into new life. In freedom, we practice the sacred art of creative change. Life is constantly changing. We learn to see this change, even the changes we don't want, as opportunities to bring something new. Because that's how the universe works, right? I was with my beloved, dearest, oldest, best friend, Steve Tyson. And we were talking about his brother, Neil Tyson. And I don't know if you guys have ever listened to it or not, but Neil and I did a podcast together once about a lot of these things. But one of the things we talked about one late night at some Tyson gathering was this concept of creative change in the face of disaster. And he said, and you know how Neil is, right? And he said, billions of years ago, stars, gigantic stars, went supernova and exploded and spilled their guts across the universe. And those became our galaxies, and those became us. And so when we do this, we are doing it just like the universe does. Nothing new can come until the seed is fallen. So when we have those changes that we don't like, if we can learn to gently see what's the opportunity in this to create something new, that is what we can see. And we learn to forget. Now I'm quoting another great artist, Jim Morrison, from Soul Kitchen. Learn to forget. When you offer these to this fire, you have made that solemn clarity. The sounds of it, they sometimes reach like a scratching in the night. We learn to forget. We learn to forget. We learn to forget. And in time, each time it arises its head, and we face it with love and compassion and laughter. Martin Luther once said that the thing the devil feared the most was laughter. we learn to forget, to let it be the past. Almost done. Are you still digging it? Monsters. We're monsters. Did you know you're a monster? We are. Now, you have a choice. Either you wake up to the monster, or the monster does its thing, and you don't even know it. It's like poor Larry Talbot again. He wakes up after a night of destroying and slaying creatures as the wolf. And then he wakes up and he doesn't remember any of it. That's the way it is a lot, right? Others know it. There's a blood trail. Well, we're like, what? When did that happen? Not me. Or we allow the monsters in us to be a strength. Strength. Because it either comes out as immature aggression or it can come out as integrated courage. It's the strength. The monster is the part of us that is the strength. You know, when we go off, you know, I'm an introvert, believe it or not, by nature. I've had to learn to be extroverted to do this and lead this group. But I'm naturally an introvert. You give me a cave in a dark place and I love to go there, as long as there's some books. This monster is our strength, but what happens, right? You go out, you're in the world, right? And you're not yourself. And maybe people treat you a certain way, you know? And your persona wants to come up and say, oh, it's okay. It's okay for you to be that way with me. I don't have to. It's all right. And you kind of put up with it, and then you go home, right? And that's when it's like, oh, how could they do this to me? How could they treat me this way? That's the monster that has not been blessed. But the monster that is awakened, that's the courage to not do that. To not stand by when you see things said or done and just, no. And it doesn't mean you're some righteous, asinine individual either. It just means that you have the courage now, the monster. No, I'm not going to let you do that. I'm not going to take that. That monster is the place from which you can be the kindest and most accepting and most compassionate person you are. If you don't, you play out of your persona. You play out of that ego's condition. When you have that courage of the monster, I am not kind to other people because I'm good, or necessarily even that nice. I'm not kind to others because that's who I am. No, I'm not that at all. My wife, my son, and anybody that's known me when I was younger will tell you, no, man, I got a hurt child, and he's an angry son of a bitch. And he loves to fight. I prefer fighting over anything else. And that immature version of that is just aggression. Aggression at others and aggression at myself. But when I wake up and I realize and I embrace the shadow, that monster becomes my courage. I now can be kind to you and understanding, not because I'm afraid of you or because I think it's what I should do. It's because I can now. Because I am strong. I'm a monster. I could eat you for dinner. But I don't, because I'm awake. But it gives me the courage to be kind, the courage to disarm you with love. Well, that's monsters. Mindfully out of strength and not fear. One last one. That's this fellow right here. Now, these are icons, not idols. The difference between an icon and an idol is something you look at and it stops you. And that idol doesn't have to be some graven image. That idol can be your religious idea, your political idea, your socioeconomic ideal. Whatever it is, it can be your idol. And you know what? You don't think beyond it. You can't see anything else beyond it. You can't hear an opinion outside of your own. And so an idol is anything that stops you. I often say that the difference between judgment and discernment, which is a lot, but subtle, is that judgment is an opinion, very strongly held, that is never open to any more information, not any more understanding. Whereas discernment, which I believe comes from that awakened place, is an opinion, even passionately held, that says, you know what, man? I may not be seeing the whole picture. I might not understand the whole thing. My Dharma brother, Jeff Bridges, would say, you know, new shit has come to light, man. So that's the difference. This figure, which is known as Mahakala, or Fudo in Japanese, Fudo Myo, the immovable one, is an icon through which to see this aspect of ourselves. He's known as the unshakable Lord and King of Light, fearsome form that assumes many faces and many names, that spans across multitudes of cultures. In the desert, he's known as the Lord of the Tent and the Malik Adonai. But he represents, symbolizes the archetype of this reality that is within us. He's known as the Great Black One. He is the protector of the Dharma. Now the story is this, that he was once this horrible creature, a demon, and he went to get the Buddha and eat him. And the Buddha turned to him and said, I love you. And he converted this great being into the servant and protector of those who practice the way of awakening. So he is my best buddy. That's what he represents. He represents all of that. And he's also, in Buddhism, the Buddhas or Bodhisattvas have two faces. He's actually the fearsome face of the Buddha of compassion, Kanzeon, Avalokiteshvara. Because it's understood in our practice anyway, that enlightenment always has two faces, one that's fierce and one that's kind and loving. But this cosmic monster, converted by the Buddhas, as Guillermo said, becomes our liberator, our absolver, refuge, breaker of obstacles, protector, binding of ignorance, hatred and greed with the chain of compassion. That's the chain he holds. He binds up all those delusions and hatred and greed. And then he cuts through them with the sword of wisdom. He is the great vampire. I got to do it because I haven't mentioned vampires yet. He's the great vampire of taking and receiving. In Tibetan, this is called Tonglen. But he takes everything, everything. He represents that which was in us. He takes everything and he transforms it. He transforms it into love, into light. And transforms the poisons into medicine. And that becomes the elixir of limitless life. And he lives in the fiery furnaces of our hell. So wherever our hell is, he lives there. As I mentioned earlier, when I was working 8-9 years in prison, working with gangs, working with inmates, running a halfway house for 5 years, they love this guy. Because nobody else does. They love him. And he became their patron saint, a way for them to see that despite all the darkness, there was more to them. So, I will round it up by just saying this, that I hope tonight, in some small symbolic way, you take a little bit of time here in the next moments we have, and you allow whatever it is that you've never forgiven yourself for, that you've never forgiven someone else for, and you allow in some small way, and you don't even have to write it all out. I need a lot of paper, but just symbolically, even letters, and give it to the fire of enlightenment. Give it to that. Let it go. And when we let go, we're not letting go like this. That's how everyone imagines it. When we let go, it's like this. I'm no longer grasping it, but I see it as it is. And I hold it in my palm. And I bring it to my heart. That's letting go. So I hope and pray in some small way this will be a start for you. Thank you. So I'd like now for us to spend some time in silence.